Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And today, our guest is Senator David Shoebridge. He's in the Senate of Australia, and he's a Green. We don't have Greens in our Senate, but they have 11 of them in Australia. And he was elected to a 6-year term in 2022. Before that, he served in the New South Wales State Legislative Council from 2010 to 2022. And before that, on the Woollahra Municipal Council, I guess I pronounced that right, from 2004 to 2012. And before that, he was an elected official. He was a practicing lawyer, focusing on personal injury, employment, discrimination, and tort cases. And he's known as an outspoken advocate on human rights, including Aboriginal rights and the Julian Assange case, on climate justice, and on militarism and ending the genocide in Gaza. And we'll put a link in the program notes to an article he wrote recently about the recent Australian elections called From Gaza to the Gas Fields, Why the Greens Won't Back Down. And it's his take on the last election where the Greens maintained their vote at about 12%, but they lost 3 out of their 4 House members. And I won't go into that. Maybe we can talk about it a little later, but they maintained their 11 members in the 76-member Senate, which is elected by proportional ranked choice voting. So the Greens in the Senate have the sole balance of power, and the Labor government is going to need Green votes to pass legislation that the Conservative parties oppose, which means, they are the balance of power. So among the portfolios that the Green Parliamentary Caucus, or they call it the Green Party Room in Australia, have assigned to Senator Shoebridge are foreign affairs, peace, and nuclear disarmament, and also defense and veterans affairs. And it's these areas we want to focus on today in this discussion, particularly the Greens' anti-AUKUS campaign. AUKUS is an acronym for Australia, the UK, and the US, AUKUS, that refers to the new military agreement between Australia, the UK, and the US, which is about basing US and UK nuclear-powered attack submarines in Australia, and eventually Australia acquiring their own nuclear-powered attack submarines, and also sharing other high-tech military technologies like maybe hypersonic missiles and electronic warfare. So, David, thank you very much for being here. And tell us in America about AUKUS and why the Greens are campaigning against it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Howie. And it's good to be speaking about this, particularly with a US audience, because from an Australian perspective, AUKUS is pretty dominant in our defence rhetoric, the federal government's defence rhetoric, and there's largely a unity ticket between our equivalent of the Democrats and the Republicans here. We have a Labor Party, which is notionally left of centre, although increasingly sort of centre right. They're the government, and we have 2 parties, sort of a National Party and a Liberal Party. But the Liberal Party here is anything but liberal. They're very much of the sort of right-wing coalition here. You probably wouldn't recognise them as extreme right. They're probably a moderate, relatively moderate right-wing party from a US perspective. But that Labor Party and the coalition, they're in lockstep on this AUKUS policy. And the AUKUS policy is this tripartite agreement between Australia, the UK, and the US, which is meant to be about sharing defence technology and sharing defence material, as well as producing in its first stage, it's called Pillar 1, a program where Australia is meant to get nuclear-powered submarines. Initially, the plan is to buy some second-hand Virginia-class submarines from the United States in the mid-2030s, early to mid-2030s. And then sometime later, from the 2040s through to the 2060s and beyond, to be producing our own nuclear submarines in a co-production arrangement with the UK, because the UK has as you're probably aware, a separate nuclear submarine program, which is in a whole world of trouble. and so that's the basic program to really enmesh the Australian economy and the Australian military into the US largely. I mean, the UK project is important for the AUKUS thing, but for the bulk of the defence arrangements under AUKUS, it's to enmesh the Australian defence and defence industry as a bit part in a much larger US military industrial base, but also increasingly a US deployments in Australia as part of a kind of containment of China. From an Australian perspective, you know, I see this as an incredible danger to our sovereignty. We're largely becoming a site for US military bases. We have about 2,500 Marines in Darwin, which is to the north of us. We have pre-positioned B-52 bombers from the United States in an air base, again in the north of Australia. They're nuclear capable. Australia hosts, and largely a US, but it pretends to be a US and Australian spy base called Pine Gap, right in the middle of our country, which is critical for US global intelligence gathering and satellite communications. We have a base in the northwest of Australia called the Harold Holt Base, which is important for US long-range communications with its submarine fleet, perhaps globally critical for the United States. And we're in the process of building the United States, at Australian taxpayers' expense, a nuclear attack submarine base off one of our major cities called Perth in the west of Australia, the southwest of Australia. We're spending about $1.7 billion Australia to build the US a nuclear attack base off Perth as part of this AUKUS deployment. So from an Australian perspective, we may get some slightly greater access to some military equipment and some intellectual property in that regard, but it comes at the cost of like a wholesale surrendering of our sovereignty, and I find that incredibly problematic.
Well, when I was in your office, when I was in Australia last month, and we talked briefly, I picked up some of the literature, and I'll just show people. You know, this one says, if I can get it on the screen, Australia needs an independent foreign policy, not one in lockstep with U.S. interests, as you were just talking about. And then on the backside, it has, you know, a lot of bullet points making that case. This is just to show that the Greens are really campaigning on this. And there's this 4-page flyer, which links AUKUS to the climate question. And maybe you could say a few words about that. What's the connection there?
Well, I mean, when we're looking at our region, so, you know, people are familiar with where Australia is. We're down in the sort of the unfashionable southern part of East Asia in Oceania. To the north of us is the Indonesian archipelago. We're surrounded by Pacific Island states. And if you wanted to ask what the biggest, you know, imminent security risk for Australia is, it's not as AUKUS is designed to respond to, which is some kind of invasion or war with China, which is, you know, that may be the US's interest, but it's definitely not our interest. Our biggest security risk is actually destabilization from rampant climate change. There's very real concern that will see the disappearance of a significant number of Pacific Island countries, where Australia has very close historic and defence interests. As they become ever more vulnerable, they will be looking to anybody to invest in, and they'll also see potentially significant population flows, uncontrolled population flows, and as well as in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and the countries to our immediate north. They are incredibly vulnerable to even modest levels of sea level rises and to the disruptive effects of climate change as it produces water scarcity, food scarcity, fights over resources in states that are already relatively vulnerable to the north of us. So if we were to think what our biggest security risk is, and you know, let's put into one side more extreme heat in a country as dry and hot as Australia. If we were to think what our biggest security risk is, it's almost certainly not China. or any foreign nation threatening us, the biggest security risk is actually climate. And instead of Australia spending the hundreds of billions of Australian dollars that we would need to spend on addressing decarbonising our economy, removing ourselves from being a global fossil fuel exporter, which is fueling the climate change, instead of spending money to make our neighbours more resilient and to build those kinds of connections, economic connections that will help them survive already what's pre-programmed into climate with climate change, we are instead spending an incredible amount from an Australian perspective, some $375 billion Australian, to build some nuclear submarines and to pretend that our security will be furthered by perhaps having 6 submarines by 2060, nuclear-powered submarines, at an incredible cost to the Australian taxpayer. And that has largely removed the funding pool that we would have to have those other positive engagements with our region and to actually deal with climate change. So what AUKUS does is it tries to persuade the Australian people that we should be spending a huge amount of effort to protect our national interest from China, which is thousands of kilometres from our shore, our single largest trading partner by a significant margin. We should be spending our time preparing for and going to war with China at the beck and call of the United States, rather than dealing with what our primary security risk is, which is actually climate change. And what is very frustrating from an Australian perspective is our government in 2022 and 2023 did an actual review into the national security implications from climate change. That was an election commitment they made in 2022. They did the review from Australia's premier international foreign affairs agency, secret agency that reports directly to our Prime Minister. And the results were so shocking and the impacts so large that they decided they could not share that review with the Australian public, and it's been hidden under top secrecy ever since. So, yes, when we think about what our real security challenges are to human security in Australia, our real security challenges are climate, and instead we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on AUKUS.
And the Greens are opposed to AUKUS, and the other 2 parties are for it, as I understand. So how are you going to stop it? Given, you do have leverage in the Senate. You're, the 3rd major party in Australia. And one of the results of the last election is fewer and fewer people are voting for the old parties, which is a good trend for the Greens. So, what's the strategy for the campaign to stop AUKUS?
Well, when I took over this role as defence spokes for the party in 2022, after the election in 2022, when I entered the Senate. And at the time, we did a very thorough assessment of what our campaign goals should be. And at the top of that was actually ending this AUKUS arrangement. Because not only is it a gross misdirection of our defence budget, it will actually tie us into a war if the US chooses to have one with China. I mean, it's entirely creating an Australian Defence Force which has no independent capacity to act and is literally designed to be what's called interoperable with the United States military. So pretty much useless on its own and only useful as part of a US deployment up against, and in our region, that's really focused on China. They're incredibly dangerous for us. We don't want to go to war with China. We have no strategic interests in going to war with China. It would be disastrous for the Chinese people, disastrous for Australia, disastrous for the region. And so we said, well, how can we fight against this AUKUS deal, which has, as you point out, the support of the 2 largest parties in Australia, the Labor Party and the Coalition. And we just said, well, we'll just start talking to the public directly about the insanity, the sort of intellectual and defence insanity that underpins AUKUS. And I've got to tell you that conversation with the Australian public has been incredibly persuasive. Polling for public support for AUKUS in 2022 showed, very large majority support, about 70% support of Australians supporting AUKUS. Polling that for just earlier this year, just before our federal election, showed that support for AUKUS has fallen to less than a third of Australian public supporting the AUKUS project. So we believe once we confirm that and confirm the position of the Australian public. And I think it's only going to get stronger over the next 3 years, and we can probably talk about some reasons why. We will be in a very good position in the next federal election to take increasing numbers and to really make our current Labor government suffer some extreme political pain if it decides to continue down this project, because it is overwhelmingly being rejected by the Australian public. And there's multiple reasons why the Australian public is looking at a partnership with the United States at this moment and saying, actually, we don't want to be a part of that. As we're having this, recording this podcast, your president, President Trump, is sending US Marines into LA on top of National Guard going into LA. And from an Australian perspective, that makes us very anxious about the 2,500 US Marines that are pre-positioned in our city of Darwin to the north of Australia. Because if your president's willing to send Marines against his own citizens, well, then what if any constraints and protections are there from Australians that he wouldn't also be willing to send them against Australians in Darwin? And they're deployed across the country. We also see this incredibly erratic behavior from President Trump, dangerous, erratic behavior from President Trump, and asking ourselves, do we really want to be a bit part, sort of a minor part, in a US military, global military posture that is run by such erratic and, quite frankly, dangerous individuals as President Trump? And the Australian population don't want to borrow that. They can just see how dangerous and destabilizing and unpredictable and unreliable the United States has become under someone like President Trump, and are saying to our government, well, then why are you on a 40-year bet to sign up to this AUKUS deal, to spend hundreds of billions of dollars in a 5-decade partnership with the United States to produce nuclear submarines? They don't look like they're going to be a reliable partner for 6 months, let alone 6 decades. And I think that's becoming, almost like the overwhelming majority opinion from the Australian public. Now, of course, as you would know, Howie, the elites, political elites, can quite often defy the will of the majority of the public for years and years on end. But what it does do is it utterly undermines their political credibility and their political base. And so that's the project we're on. We think we have the Australian public behind us. We think that public support to end AUKUS is only going to get bigger and stronger. We see the US becoming more, not less, erratic and unreliable. And it's my prediction that AUKUS will not last out this decade, if it gets to the end of this decade.
What's been the public reaction to the Australian news reporter for 9 News in Sydney getting shot by a rubber bullet? I mean, there's already been at least a minor casualty in this confrontation in Los Angeles. Is that a big issue, a big story in Australia?
Yeah, there's again widespread public anger, but our government has said next to nothing about it. And one of the reasons is they're frightened of offending Donald Trump and the Trump administration. But if you watch the video footage of that Australian reporter, who was a good 20 meters away from the police line, obviously a reporter, had a cameraman and a microphone and was speaking to the camera, you can actually see the US police officer sort of do a beeline, draw a direct line on her with the rifle firing the rubber bullet, and then target her and shoot her. And it's created a lot of anger in the Australian public, and not unreasonably. I would hope it's creating anger in the American public as well, because when you have police on the ground, or National Guards people on the ground, or Marines on the ground, deliberately and consciously targeting the media at an event like that, it's an incredibly dangerous thing to happen.
Yeah, we'll put a link to that video you just described in the program notes. I wonder, how can the Australian government, even if they want to cooperate with the US, trust them, given, the Signal chat scandal and threats against the sovereignty of Canada and Denmark via Greenland, tariff trade wars and Trump's general dismissal of allies and his unpredictability.
Well, I'll be honest, it beggars belief. I mean, there are so many institutional connections, though, between our military and the United States military. Senior members of our defense force view their career as being developed in lockstep with their US counterparts. You know, exchanges to Washington, delivering US weapons platforms here at incredible cost, maintaining those weapons platforms. Like, they are career defining for many of the most senior Australian military officials, and also in our defence department. You'll also often see former Australian defence ministers who have been responsible for multi-billion-dollar procurement deals. They leave Parliament and then go straight into and get jobs, senior jobs, often board members of US weapons primes, you know, Lockheed Martin and the like. There is I would call that a very corrupted culture, and very much contrary to the Australian national interest. But it explains in part why we are so wedded to this sort of subservient position with the US military. But I think also there's a long-standing cultural cringe in Australia. We feel like we're unable to defend ourselves, and therefore we have to rely upon some great and powerful friend who will come running to the rescue to defend ourselves. I mean, traditionally in Australia, that was seen as being the United Kingdom through our, you know, colonial history, with the UK being a UK colony. But then in World War II, that didn't turn out so well. And Australia just then decided to latch on to the United States and see our defence as inherently reliant, you know, dependent upon the United States coming to our rescue. Now, the Australian public has very fond regards for what the United States did in World War II in our region, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. I share those regards for the for what the United States did in World War II. There was, you know, a direct threat to the north of Australia, at least, in World War II, and it was the cooperation with the United States and the incredible resources of the United States that was critically important at that point for us. And there's an enormous amount of gratitude in the Australian public for that. But rock on now, some 70, 80 years after that, and the relationship with the United States is fundamentally different. I mean, Australia has a sufficient industrial base to produce defence material to protect ourselves. We can protect ourselves, particularly given how asymmetric defence and offence has become in the last few decades, as has been demonstrated in conflicts such as the Ukraine. And instead of us learning those lessons from the Ukraine and working out how to defend ourselves, probably with, you know, significant production of drones and missiles and asymmetric kind of defence material, we are instead still buying the same kind of weapons platforms we were purchasing 20, 30, 40 years ago at incredible expense from US weapons manufacturers largely. So, you know, the lack of imagination, the lack of courage, that ongoing cultural cringe from Australia is also part of why we're so wedded to the United States, even as we can watch it unravel. You know, even as we watch it threatening Canada and threatening Greenland and threatening NATO allies and becoming so unreliable. It's that cultural cringe that Australia has that it partly explains this. And I'll just finish with this. Like, if you wanted to find a country on the planet that is the most geopolitically secure on the planet, you would probably pick Australia, right? Because it is sufficiently large that it's got an industrial and resource base to defend itself. It's miles away from any significant military threat. There's this huge archipelago and oceans around us that protect us. There is no country in the world that starts with better defense assets than Australia. We are perfectly capable of using them to defend ourselves without the United States. And I suppose that's the challenge, getting that message across to the Australian public as well.
So you were talking about AUKUS, you know, integrating Australia into U.S. military policy, foreign policy with respect to China. But, you know, there's also the question of Palestine and Gaza, which is on your flyer. You know, what does AUKUS have to do with Palestine and Gaza? So talk about how Australia is kind of roped into what Israel's doing in Gaza.
Yeah. Well, there are two parts to AUKUS. The first one is called Pillar One, which is this submarine proposal where we spend 375 billion Australian dollars to get a handful of nuclear submarines, which make no use on their own, would be of no use on their own. They're obviously only used as part of a US deployment. That's Pillar One, the submarine project. Pillar Two, though, is this enmeshing of the Australian defence industry and our research industry, our universities, our enmeshing of that within the US military and the US military industry. And it's already been partly put in place by removing most of the controls for the flow of defence material and defence research and other primary research that could be related to defence. We used to have quite significant controls. You couldn't export defence material from Australia to the United States without getting permits. You couldn't send it from the United States to Australia without getting permits. Most of those requirements have now been removed to open up a free flow of material and intellectual property between Australia and the US and the US and Australia. We've seen a sort of global precedent for this already in the form of the F-35 fighter jet. Now, the F-35 fighter jet is a US platform delivered by Lockheed Martin, one of your largest defence primes, and it was designed to enmesh 15 different allies into the production of the F-35, where we all produce bits of it, and therefore we all have a buy-in to it. But ultimately, the F-35, where it goes, who's it sold to, when it can be used, is entirely determined by the United States. So at the moment, Australia has about 70 companies producing parts for the F-35, including a number of parts where we're the sole global provider. For example, we provide the mechanism that opens the bomb bay doors of the F-35, that attaches a bunch of weapons to the F-35. We send them all off to the United States, and the United States sends them wherever the hell they like. And in this case, they're pumping them into Israel for the Israeli Defense Forces F-35 fighter jets. The Australian, and that is now part of not just the F-35 project with AUKUS and removing of any limits on how Australian weapons and parts flow to the United States and then from the United States to wherever the hell the United States wants to send them. We're also seeing that done with other weapons platforms as well. And we're seeing Australian weapons platforms turn up in Israel, being washed through the United States. Now, our government says that they are not directly exporting any weapons to Israel. And, there's a small truth in that. We're not directly exporting weapons to Israel. We just wash them through the United States, whether it's the F-35 parts or other weapons parts. And that makes us directly complicit in what I firmly believe is an appalling genocide against the people of Gaza, delivered in significant parts by weapons platforms which are, significantly contributed to by Australian industry. And that's intended to be the template going forward, where we really don't have control over our defence industry, where we supply widgets and parts into large US weapons platforms, and the US then decides where they're going to send them, which conflicts they'll send them to, and what we're seeing in Gaza, and that appalling conflict against the people of Gaza is just a little intro into how it's intended to work globally.
One of the things that struck me when I was in Australia in April, it was right before the election. You guys have great signage and literature, and in front of the polling place across the street from the state legislative council in the Capital District was a sign, posted on a pole right outside the polling place saying "Sanction Israel." And then there was another sign I saw a lot that said, "In the invasion of Gaza, stop military exports to Israel." And you guys were very upfront about that. And I know the Zionist lobby and people in the Labor Party and business community, they really attacked you for that. But I'm wondering how the public, in Australia feels about that. In the United States, from a few weeks after the war in Gaza started, we've had a majority of people for an arms embargo of Israel. And it just increased and then they stopped polling last June. But on that question, the problem is public opinion doesn't translate into public policy, particularly here where the Democrats who are, who the street demonstrations are basically lobbying, don't feel any threat. They can just let those demonstrations roll off. So what's public opinion in Australia on the war in Gaza and Australia's relationship to it?
Well, there are obviously parts of our of the public that are incredibly supportive of Israel and are unwilling to brook any criticism of Israel's military or the attacks on Gaza. The coalition party here, which is the right-wing party, they are, very one-sided in their view. They say Israel has a right to defend itself, and that's the beginning of and the end of their inquiries. The Labor Party, who's in government, will is on record as saying that they're disturbed by the level of violence that they see in Gaza. They're disturbed when they see hospitals bombed. They're troubled when they see schools bombed. They're troubled at the lack of aid getting in. They're troubled at war being a weapon of starvation being used as a weapon of war. That they're troubled by all of that. But then when we say to them, okay, well, fine, we're troubled by that too, deeply troubled by it. You should respond by sanctioning the extremist elements in the Netanyahu government, by preventing any two-way weapons flows between Australia and Israel. And Australia has current contracts for about $2 billion worth of Israeli weapons, which have, sold to Australia as have been tested in Palestine and therefore are battle ready. We say, well, to the Australian government, we'll cancel those contracts, cancel some $2 billion of defence contracts with Israel, and don't send any weapons or weapons parts into Israel, either directly or indirectly, and take some real action. And the Labor government just refuses to do that. And I've got to say, as this appalling, you could call it a war, but it's really just an appalling continued act of violence, state-directed violence against the people of Gaza at this stage of the conflict. The Australian public is increasingly horrified by what they're seeing. But there are still segments of the Australian public that are uncritically supportive of Israel, but it's an increasingly small chunk of the public. And, my view is the majority of Australians, like the majority of people in the United States and around the rest of the world, they can see this for what it is. It's just an appalling ongoing abuse of largely defenseless people in Gaza. And that's not to minimize what happened on the 7th of October in 2023. That was horrific. But to see that being continued to be used as a justification for the endless killings of Palestinian civilians that we see now, the majority of Australia does not believe that's justified. Just as I'm pretty certain the majority of those engaged in the United States on the issue would not believe it's even close to justified either.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you thought public opinion was going to keep turning against AUKUS, and I would assume that would include relations to Israel on the war in Gaza and just militarism in general. I mean, part of the problem I see with this AUKUS is nuclear proliferation. Just one thing, I work a lot on Ukraine solidarity, and we want, Ukraine to have the weapons it needs to defend itself. But the governments, and I'm thinking of the UK in particular, are using the need to build up their defense capacity to help Ukraine as an excuse. The UK is talking about building 12 more nuclear armed attack submarines, which will have nothing. Ukraine doesn't need them.
I mean, good luck. Good luck to the UK on that. They just simply don't have a budget to come even close to producing 12 nuclear attack submarines. It's a press release, not an actual project. And if you have a look at one of the other reasons, I mean, assuming that I did want Australia to get half a dozen nuclear attack submarines, and I don't. I think it's dangerous and bad. It has us getting access to highly enriched uranium. which can then be converted into nuclear weapons. Like, it's bad for nuclear proliferation. It's bad for Australia. But assuming that if you did want Australia to get half a dozen nuclear submarines, there is no way you would partnership with the United Kingdom. Their nuclear reactor program, which is obviously essential to getting a nuclear, their next class of nuclear submarines built, is in complete meltdown. Their own independent audit office says it won't produce nuclear reactors. It's probably decades behind time. The UK's nuclear submarine fleet rarely goes out because it's so poorly maintained. They haven't got the money to maintain it, let alone the money to design a whole new class and build a whole new class of nuclear submarines. I mean, it's kind of fantasy level from the UK, but it is part of this ongoing rhetoric about, increasing defense expenditure, finding enemies, arming up to oppose enemies. Like, it's a dangerous rhetoric. But the reality behind it from the UK is like paper thin, and from an Australian perspective as well. Like, I mean, the optimal pathway that's been set down for Australia to get nuclear submarines is in the sort of 2033, 2034. We're meant to get a couple of secondhand, hopefully renovated and freshly painted, Virginia-class nuclear submarines from the United States in the 2033, 2034. And your own Congressional Research Service attached to Congress, people who have spent decades and decades looking at the US capacity to produce its naval fleet, have said that in the early to mid 2030s, the US is going to have a record low number post-war of nuclear attack submarines. They're going to have nowhere near enough for the United States' own needs. And the US industrial capacity to produce additional nuclear submarines to meet that shortfall is woefully inadequate. I mean, the numbers are that I think the United States has to have been producing about 2.5 nuclear submarines a year from last year all the way through to 2033 to have any spare to produce to Australia. And the US has been knocking out about 1.2 or 1.3. And you're just about you're in the middle of applying your industrial base to produce a whole new class of doomsday nuclear submarines, the Columbia class, that are going to be carrying intercontinental ballistic missiles. You're in the middle of producing those as well. So roll on to 2033. Australia's shoveling billions of dollars to the United States to help build your industrial capacity. We're shoveling billions of dollars to the UK to try and sort out their muddle and their failure to produce nuclear reactors. We're shoveling all this money out. And I bet my bottom dollar by 2033, when we then say to your next US president, or maybe it'll be Donald Trump in his 15th year in office, we say to them, oh, by the way, can we have that secondhand nuclear submarine now, please? They're going to laugh at us. They're going to say, we haven't got enough for ourselves. We're not going to give you any, but thanks for the billions of dollars in the meantime. And thanks for building the attack base off Perth. And thanks for positioning all those B-52s. And thanks for becoming part of our defense industry. We're really grateful, but no submarines. Like, the whole thing from an Australian perspective is a ridiculously short-sighted gamble.
Yeah, so the U.S. gets submarine bases and you get no submarines is, what it sounds like.
And when we pay for and build a US submarine base off Perth. I mean, the Australian public have not been asked whether or not they want to fork out $1.7 billion and counting to build a US attack submarine base off Perth. And even US defense hawks say that if once that gets up and running, if it does, and there's like 5 US nuclear submarines pre-positioned there, and they're pre-positioned there in order to go up north to the Malacca Straits, which is a choke point in international shipping, sort of around Singapore way. It's a shortcut there from Australia rather than having to go all the way from the west coast of the US. What US defense hawks say that if there is, even a limited nuclear exchange between China and the United States, that would be pretty much in the top echelon of targets. We're literally making ourselves a nuclear target simply to provide the US with an advanced submarine attack base. I mean, it's insane from an Australian perspective.
Yeah, well, insane from a U.S. perspective. What do you think, how in the U.S. should we, raise this issue. We got a huge problem with militarism. The public's for an arms embargo of Israel, but Trump's not going to do it. In the Congress, they got a bill now in the House to stop offensive weapons to Israel, but I don't think it's going to get to a vote anytime soon. Bernie Sanders got a vote on that question in November, and he got between 15 and 17 senators, and he raised it again in March, and he got only 15. So that shows you how far we are. Out of 100 senators, we got 15 for an arms embargo, even though the public wants it. So, my question is, what would you like to see us do, to help on this anti-AUKUS campaign?
Well, I mean, I would love to see the green movement, the peace movement, just the people who want a sort of safe and sustainable planet in the United States join with us to try and get rid of this AUKUS deal. Because really, the AUKUS deal is, from a US perspective, one of the ways in which the US military can pretend to still have an ongoing capacity to attack and contain China and continue down that pathway of being a military opponent to China. That endless escalation of military in our region, in the Western Pacific, which is driven by the US military and a continuing desire from the United States to be able to impose its military will on China and on other countries in our region, that is incredibly destabilizing and dangerous. And it potentially gets the United States and its military involved in a war that they have a very good chance of losing. Because, modern military, in a modern conflict, the pendulum has really swung to defense. If you want to sail out, US nuclear aircraft carriers or US Marines or offensive capacity, thousands and thousands of kilometers away from the US mainland, and put it in China's backyard and neighborhood and attack China, you might have a few Australian nuclear submarines sort of floating nearby and a couple of, Australian paid for F-35s, and you might have some B-52s coming from Australia and some pre-positioned Marines, but you're pretty much fighting in someone else's backyard at a huge geostrategic disadvantage. And to continue to push for that as a sort of viable pathway for the United States against an economy that is only growing, and to continue to want to impose US military control over a region so far from their shores and so close to another major power. Like, that's incredibly dangerous for the United States and the United States military. It's incredibly destabilizing for world peace. And what I would be hoping is that there is a groundswell in the United States to ask them, well, why are you doing this? Why do you want to continue to have this geopolitical military conflict? Surely there are other ways of engaging far more peacefully and productively with China. And I'm not suggesting being a doormat for China and just simply agreeing to whatever the Chinese government's demands are. Work with allies, work with friends, have multilateral responses. But the idea that the primary response is a military response through arrangements like AUKUS is incredibly dangerous. It's dangerous for Australia. It's disastrous for our region. And I've got to say, it's incredibly dangerous for the United States and its military.
Yeah, well, I think that's our main argument, that this escalation of the military on both sides, including nuclear, is not a solution to whatever issues we have with China. We share with them the problem of climate. The trade wars is, not the way to resolve these economic problems. And throwing money down the military hole, it's only going to end up in a war that we'll have a hard time coming out of in one piece. It just doesn't make any sense.
And the appalling human and environmental cost, but human, social, environmental cost that will do to wherever that war is fought. And, that's Australia's backyard, is so obscene that it's hard to imagine that there are policymakers actively progressing this as their sort of preferred pathway for resolving disputes. I mean, we have an increasingly small planet facing increasingly tight resource constraints, facing increasingly globalized challenges. And obviously this sort of endless militarism is not the way we're going to resolve those challenges and keep us all safe and really build on human security.
And related to nuclear weapons is nuclear power, which I remember seeing some signage and literature that the Greens are opposing the expansion of nuclear power in Australia. We now have a full speed ahead from Trump administration, although Biden was subsidizing the expansion of nuclear power here, which is, a total waste of money. I mean, you can build a lot more gigawatts with solar and wind a lot faster than you can with what you spend on nuclear power plants. But what's going on in Australia? I mean, who's behind the expansion of nuclear power there? And,
Yeah. Well, there are a bunch of spivs hanging around off the AUKUS deal, thinking that once Australia has the infrastructure needed to deal with the nuclear reactors that come from nuclear submarines, that's a great base upon which they can then start selling state-subsidized nuclear power stations and a bigger nuclear industry. There's another bunch of spivs in Australia who want to sell Australia as a global dump for high-level nuclear waste. And they say, well, Australia's big, lots of it's desert. Why don't we just bury stuff in Australia and become a global dump for nuclear waste? I mean, both of those proposals are incredibly dangerous for Australia and against our national interest. The right-wing party here, the Coalition, took to the most recent election a proposal that Australia spends, I think, $600 billion on building like half a dozen nuclear reactors around the country. That was about as popular as a fart in an elevator with the Australian public, and was one of the reasons why the Coalition lost a number of seats in the federal election. And the Australian public just intuitively think it's ridiculous. I mean, if you have a look at Australia, it's very big. It has a lot of desert. It's got a lot of coastline. It's got a lot of wind. It's got probably the best renewable real estate anywhere on the planet. And for a fraction of the cost of nuclear, we can totally wire the country up with incredibly long-term low cost, or some of it close to zero cost, renewable energy. And become in many ways a renewable energy superpower. Obviously that threatens fossil fuel profits in the short term and the longer term. We have a big fossil fuel industry here, largely with export gas projects and export coal projects. They're horrified at the idea of Australia becoming a global leader in renewable energy. And one of the ways they're trying to put off the investment in renewables, which is, as you point out, for each marginal kilowatt hour of energy, vastly cheaper than any other option. One of the ways they're trying to put that off is to say, oh, well, renewables are unreliable. We need, therefore, to invest in clean nuclear power and do this incredibly wasteful investment in what they call clean nuclear power. I mean, there's no such thing as clean nuclear power. It's not only carbon intensive, extracting all the ores and building the projects, but obviously it leaves, a highly toxic nuclear waste for beyond any kind of sensible civilization timeframe. So, in Australia, they tried to sell this nuclear power project. It was unpopular. I think it lost them votes. But I doubt they've gone away entirely, because they see the AUKUS deal as a base upon which to build a nuclear industry, nuclear power industry in Australia, and they haven't given it away entirely. My hope is that we have a rational enough government between the Labor Party and the Greens in the balance of power that we can put the public investment into renewables, and the public can see for themselves just how much cheaper that is to get clean, endlessly renewable power for them.
Yeah, when I read about the election and how the Labor Party was attacking you for being obstructionist on climate policy and housing policy, and the reality was it was Labor that really didn't want to negotiate, but you had enough leverage to get something. And it looks like in the next election cycle, you've got more leverage. So
well, we go into this parliament with, you know, the sole balance of power in the Senate. Like our government has two ways of getting legislation through. One is they can join with the coalition, the sort of right-wing other party. And, you know, just like in the United States, there's a huge amount that the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress agree on. There's a fair chunk that Labor and the coalition agree on. And they largely get their, you know, big chunks of their economic platform through by agreement. But where they can't agree, their only other pathway is through the Greens. There is no other pathway in the Senate. They need to deal with us to get legislation through, and just us. No other complicated third-party negotiations. We're hoping to use that to really kind of direct our economy towards renewable energy, to direct our social spend towards building universal public services. I mean, we have incredibly important public health in the form of Medicare in Australia, which and public hospitals in Australia, which provide universal medical care of an incredibly high quality, paid for by Commonwealth and state governments, by our federal and state governments. We would like to see more investment in that, and to protect Australia's public health system from the threats that are coming at the moment from the Trump administration, because there are many people in the US who see Australia's public health network as a global example that threatens the very private, incredibly wasteful and incredibly unfair system that the United States has for the delivery of healthcare. And they would love to tear Australia's pharmaceutical benefit system and our Medicare system down, and we just need to be there to defend it over the next 3 years.
Yeah, it was ironic when I was in Australia, I saw signage from the Greens saying dental into Medicare. And of course, Bernie Sanders has been talking about that for our Medicare, but our Medicare is only for seniors. And you have universal coverage, but not dental. So your demand is to include dental, which I imagine is popular.
It is popular. And, you know, I can't work out why Medicare stops at your mouth. You know, it does feel like part of the body, last time I checked. And it would make incredible sense for our Medicare system to also cover dental. And there is huge public support for that as well. Particularly anyone who's ever taken their kids to the dentist or their elderly relative to the dentist. It can be incredibly expensive, and having it covered by a universal public insurance scheme in the form of Medicare is incredibly popular and needed to deal with social inequalities. In Australia, I mean, healthcare it's under pressure, like I think all healthcare systems are, but it's still an incredibly positive and well-resourced service in Australia. And often when you're having a look and you're trying to work out markers of poverty in Australia, one of the markers of poverty can be people's dental care. Poor dental care is often one of the few obvious indications of poverty in Australia, and we should end that.
You know, one of the things that struck me, I'm working on an article on what I saw in Australia because I thought the Australian Greens set a real good example for what the American Greens should be doing in terms of year-round canvassing, reaching out beyond, you know, the people you already have, community organizing, mutual aid, building a broad base, which has shown fruition in the House races, which are single-member districts, winner take all, even though they have ranked choice voting, single-member ranked choice voting. And it shows, you know, you can win those districts. And, you know, you got up to 4. Your piece that we're going to put in the program notes say, you know, you think there are 6 House seats now that are within your reach. But describe, you know, the thing about Australia was an anti-Trump election like the Canadian election was. You know, explain to people how that worked out and why the Greens' vote was maintained, but they lost a few seats in the House.
Yeah, I mean, if you followed through Australian politics for the last 3 years, you would have seen all the opinion polls, and the broad consensus was that our very sort of low achieving federal Labor government, its popularity was slowly dropping down over time. And they weren't very high anyhow. They started only on a 33% primary vote, and they were dropping and dropping and dropping over the course of 3 years. And our inadequate but sort of angry right-wing opposition party, the coalition, was slowly climbing over the last 3 years. And a lot of that was because of core issues like cost of living that have not been dealt with. You know, Australia has one of the most eye-wateringly expensive housing markets on the planet, and that produces huge intergenerational inequities. Young people not able to get a house, hardly able to afford to rent a house, let alone buy a house, and together with other costs of living, that was really seeing this lack of support for the incumbent Labor government, and a sort of unprincipled attack from our right-wing opposition. They didn't have any solutions to these things, but they were just feeding on anger about that stuff. Then you roll on to January of this year. We had our election in early May. You roll on to January in this year, and then the trajectory of political support for the Labor Party, suddenly just spiked massively upwards, and the trajectory of political support for the coalition dramatically fell by about 10 percentage points each way, which is a phenomenal diversion. And you can just map it. You can map it with the election of Trump. You can map it with his attack on Zelensky. You can map it with the crazy behavior on tariffs and the utterly unpredictable behavior on NATO and defense. And our coalition party, our right-wing party, had partly tied itself to Donald Trump and kind of used some of that kind of MAGA kind of Trumpian rhetoric up until January. They desperately then tried to backpedal and distance themselves, but they couldn't help themselves. They kept identifying common elements between their platform and Trump's platform. And that saw a collapse in the support for the coalition. It saw a move towards the Labor Party. And what that did was, as a smaller political party, the Greens, we kind of got caught in that crossfire. And in our, where there's ranked voting, we call it preference voting, but where there's ranked voting, we lost seats where there were pretty much three-way contests between the Greens, the Labor Party, and the coalition. There were similar kind of votes. And often whoever wins that is determined as much by who goes out first, who has the lowest vote, and where their preferences go. And in the cases in 2 seats in Brisbane, in fact, in all 3 seats, the Liberal Party went out first, the right-wing coalition went out first, and their preferences elected the Labor Party over the Greens. It was a very tough election for us in that regard. So I'd still urge anyone interested in democratic reform. Ranked voting is much more democratic than first past the post, but it can produce these kind of perverse outcomes sometimes. With our primary vote pretty much held up over the country. We have easily the 3rd highest vote for a political party in the country, and yet our numbers are not represented in the lower house because our vote tends to be distributed across the whole country rather than concentrated in a few seats.
Yeah, that's why I've been advocating. This is one of the first things I took up after running for president, was pushing ranked choice voting, as we call it, but saying when you're talking about legislative bodies, you got to talk about proportional ranked choice voting, like the way the Senate is elected in Australia. And I've used the comparison between the results in the House and the results in the Senate for the Greens. In both races, the first preference votes are around 12%. And you got that proportion in the Senate, and you're way below 1% in the House. It just shows that you need proportional representation, not just ranked choice voting. So that's an issue in our movement for ranked choice voting.
It won't surprise you that the political parties that benefit from the current system are highly unlikely, absent a crisis, to try and reform that system so it's actually much more democratic. But I do get a sense that both of our countries are potentially, heading towards some kind of crisis of political legitimacy, and that's a good opportunity to look for genuine democratic reform, so that our parliaments, our congresses, our elected representatives much more clearly reflect the diversity of opinion in our countries, rather than corporate-driven duopolies that both of us tend to live with.
Well, we're winning on that. It's one of the reforms that we've been winning despite the conservative climate. In 2000, we had 2 jurisdictions with ranked choice voting. By 2020, it was 20. By 2024, it was 50.
Amazing.
And Boston just adopted it. So, that's something we need to keep pushing.
Howie, I do. I'm sorry. I've got to run because this is it's a kind of busy afternoon here. I know it's 3:10 or so in Australia time, and and unfortunately, I've got a committee that I've got to prepare for in the next 15 minutes. But happy to wrap it up as you see fit.
Well, that was my last point. I really wanted you to talk about a little bit about the Australian elections, and it's late here. We're just catching up to you. You're in Tuesday. We just got into Tuesday a few minutes ago, so
well, happy
you're 14
Tuesday.
hours ahead of us.
Happy Tuesday. But look, more of this kind of international engagement, particularly amongst the Green movement, but more broadly amongst the progressive left, I think is really important. I'm really grateful for the chance to have this chat, Howie. And there's obviously a bunch of stuff we can learn in the Australian perspective from the experience you're having at the moment in confronting some of these appalling political challenges. And I think the more that we keep talking and sharing our sort of common values, looking at how we both deal with our domestic challenges, then the stronger our global movement will be right at the time that it needs it. So I really appreciate the talk, Howie.
And for the same reason, I appreciate you taking the time, and I won't hold you any longer, and we'll get this out to people here in the United States, and we'll keep talking.
Yep. Terrific. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you.